Augustana College. My name is Dag Lund, and I'm the director of the H Swanson Swedish Immigration Research Center. I'm very happy to welcome you to the 2007 Fritiof Ander Lecture in Immigration History. This year's Ander Lecture is also the beginning of the conference Friends and Neighbors, Swedes and Norwegians in the United States. The conference is co-arranged by the Swanson Center and the Swedish American Historical Society in Chicago. And so I also bid you welcome on behalf of the Society. The Center and the Society have cooperated in many ways over the years, and we look forward to many joint events in the future. I should also note that the conference is supported by a generous grant from the Swedish Council of America. This conference is also the major way in which we celebrate the fact that the Swanson Center has been open and operating for a quarter of a century. It was in the fall of 1981 that the center opened its doors, and we are quite happy for the ways in which the center has grown and developed. Let me now turn to this year's Fritiof Ander Lecture in Immigration History. As you may know, the center sponsors an annual lecture in immigration history in the memory of Fritiof Ander, a longtime professor of history at Augustana College and a pioneer in the field of immigration studies. I'm very pleased to introduce this year's Fritiof Ander Lecture in Immigration History, Dr. Thomas Tredway, President Emeritus of Augustana College. Born in Western New York State, Tredway graduated from Augustana in 1957, where he studied history with Fritiof Ander. He did graduate work at the University of Illinois and received his PhD in history from Northwestern University. He joined the history faculty at Augustana in 1964 and took leaves of Augustana to teach at the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Waterloo, Ontario, and to study in Germany. He became dean of the college in 1970 and assumed the presidency 5 years later in 1975. He served as president for 28 years until 2003, which makes him one of the longest-serving presidents in the college's history. Like Augustana's early presidents, he reads biblical Greek, has deep knowledge of Lutheran theology, and speaks several languages, including Swedish. During his years at Augustana, the college grew and developed in many ways, and throughout his life, he has made innumerable contributions to the life of this institution. Given his talk tonight, which focuses on the financial aspects of the college's history, it's worth noticing that all the fundraisers in his time were successful, each more than doubling the previous goal, and that during his time, the endowment of the campus was greatly expanded. It seems only fitting that the college named its new state-of-the-art library after Thomas Tredway in 2003. For the past couple of years, he's been engaged in writing the history of Augustana College from 1935 to 75. It is out of that work that his talk comes today, as he will talk to us on the topic of pinching pennies in the provinces, the mid-century finances of an immigrant college. Please join me in welcoming my good friend and colleague Tom Tredway as the 2007 Fritiof Ander Lecture.
Pinching pennies in the provinces, the mid-century finances of an immigrant, should have put it in quotes, college. I was emboldened to discuss this relatively obscure and even somewhat technical matter with you when I read the lecture given by the Turkish writer Orhan Pamuk in response to receiving the 2006 Nobel Prize in Literature. The title of his lecture was "In My Father's Suitcase." It turned out to be surprisingly relevant to my effort to talk about Augustana's financial situation in the middle decades of the 20th century with you tonight. The Nobel laureate says that when he was growing up, many of his Turkish countrymen regarded their land as a provincial outpost of European civilization. Pamuk's father was a Turk of that stripe. The father had literary aspirations, and during his son's youth had gone to Paris to be at the center of European cultural and literary life. While he stayed in France, the father kept notebooks and years later gave them to his son, packed up in a suitcase, hence the title. Reading those notebooks, Pommock says that he realized the yearning of people living in the provinces to be at the vibrant center of civilization, in this case Paris. But, says Orrin Pommock, he himself finally came to understand that life in those glittering capitals of the mind was no more central or meaningful than his own life on the fringe of Europe. Quote, "We all give too much importance to the idea of a world with a center. We felt provincial, excluded, marginalized, angry, or deeply melancholic. But finally, we found an entire world beyond those sentiments," Pommock says. That entire world, which for Pommock was Turkey, was filled with the hopes and struggles of humanity just as surely as war Paris or New York. I took from Pommock's speech that life itself is as authentic and meaningful in the provinces as it is in the shining central cities of the world. And perhaps by long extension, the interpretation of provincial Swedish-American college finance might reveal at least some minor insight and truth about the larger human condition itself. And if Orhan Pamuk couldn't do it, I told myself, think of Larry Scott and what he's done with the Swedes in Texas. Apropos of life in this province, I want to remind you that two great American institutions grew up in the late 19th century right here in the northeast corner of Rock Island, Illinois. One was, of course, Augustana College. The other was the Weyerhaeuser Lumber Company. The college stuck around. It stayed in Rock Island. But after the forests of the upper Middle West had been clear-cut, the lumber barons left, eventually settling in the Pacific Northwest where there are still trees to be cut. Both these institutions, Augustana and Weyerhaeuser, were begun by immigrants. Swedes, who remained Lutherans in the former case, and in the latter, Germans who more quickly Americanized, married into families with British names, and even became Presbyterians. The last significant contact between the Swedish-American educators and the Americanized lumber family came in 1954. Edwin Davis, the surviving scion of the Weyerhaeuser family, deeded the 25-room Weyerhaeuser-Davis family home and 26 acres of land to Augustana College in Rock Island. It was a gift that had doubled the size of the campus. When Mr. Davis sought to convince members of his family that that would be in the end the best way to let go of the old family estate, they had by then moved to St. Paul and Tacoma. He is purported to have said to them, "Oh, let's give the place to the Swedish Lutherans." That was in 1954. So even in the mid-20th century, Augustana was seen by its former neighbors as a Swedish Lutheran institution. That was how its president, Conrad Bergedorf, had grown up understanding it as well. He had been dean of the theological seminary that the Augustana Church sponsored here in Rock Island, and had already earned a reputation as a scholar and a churchman. And in the decades he served as college president, he gained international standing among historians and theologians, lecturing in many of the great universities of America and Europe, while still continuing to serve as president of this small college. In one sense, Bergedorf's life work could be said to be the effort to preserve and deepen the college's identity as a school of the Augustana Evangelical Lutheran Church. He sought to convince the wider world, academic, ecclesiastic, cultural, of the relevance to contemporary American life of the tradition from which this college sprang. Tonight, I want, of all things, to deal with the finances of that Swedish Lutheran school in the middle third of the 20th century, during the years when Bergedorf was its leader. While it's a topic both provincial and obscure. One disaffected local politician once called the counties of western Illinois Forgotonia, bemoaning the lack of attention that this region got in Chicago and Springfield, the state capital. He said these counties ought to secede from Illinois, and should form a new state which would immediately replace Arkansas as the poorest in the Union. Here in Florgatonia, President Bergendorf and his colleagues struggled to keep their Swedish Lutheran school alive and to strengthen it, even in the teeth of depression and war. Now, in 1935, Augustana's leaders and faculty were not, of course, literally immigrants. Most of them were born in the United States and had done advanced work in American universities. But they were the children of Swedish immigrants, and they had been shaped by what Urban Överland of the University of Bergen calls homemaking myths. These were myths designed to make immigrants feel that they really belonged in this country. The self-understanding or homemaking myths of the Augustana people blended loyalty toward the land of their mothers and fathers with pride in America and the contributions that Swedes had made to America's growth. It was important to them that Swedes had only been in North America before Columbus. They hadn't come to Minnesota. Had settled on the East Coast well before the Revolution, and that a Swede had designed the ironclad that had assisted the U.S. Navy in the Civil War. They saw Augustana itself as yet another contribution of Swedish immigrants to American society. Had we whirled enough in time, I would now threaten you with a careful chronological account of money matters on this campus in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s of the last century. I would tell you how funds were raised and how they were spent. And I would argue that this narrative reveals much about human nature itself, and especially about people in an immigrant enclave who sought to stay in contact with the wider spiritual and intellectual world of the land in which they had settled, as well as the land from which their mothers and fathers had come. My justification for that long narrative, as well as for the shorter presentation I now make, would be Orrin Pound's Nobel lecture, which reminds us that we can learn from life in the provinces as well as from life in the big cities. Time presses, so let me make some outlined observations instead of treating you to the full story. Read my forthcoming potboiler for that. Tonight, I want to deal with, first, the Bethany Beach settlement. Secondly, O.V. Anderson's warning. And third, bust and war and boom. In considering these matters, I will occasionally refer to the histories of one other Swedish-American college, Gustavus Adolphus, and two Norwegian-American schools, Luther and St. Olaf. Though I am no historian of those three schools, I do this in deference to the theme of the conference, beginning tomorrow morning. Friends and neighbors, question mark. Swedes and Norwegians in the United States. I'm indebted for what I do know about Gustavus Adolphus and Luther and St. Olaf to the three scholars who have written their histories, Donovan Lund, David T. Nelson, and Joseph Shaw, respectively. In my occasional references to these sister colleges, I rely on their research and writing. I myself am to blame for the more extensive but still only outlying history of Augustana's finances in this period. In any case, what I mainly want to show tonight is the influence of its Scandinavian Lutheran character on the life, especially financial, of Augustana in the middle third of the last century. Further, I want to demonstrate how, in time, the economic situation of Augustana and the other three institutions as well was deeply altered by conditions and events in wider American life. By the middle 1960s, anyway, Augustana's erstwhile Weyerhaeuser-Davis neighbors might not have recognized the institution of the Swedish Lutherans, to which they had generously given their family home and 26 acres only a decade earlier. The Bethany Beach settlement. In this section, I will try to illustrate the influence of Augustana's Swedish-American roots and ties on both the financial crisis the college faced in the Depression and the school's efforts to gain financial support from Midwestern Swedish Americans once the war was over. As I said, Conrad Bergendorf became the president of Augustana in the worst of the Depression. The times had been hard for college presidents. At Luther College, Dr. Oscar L. Olson had been asked by his church's Board of Education to resign because of the college's fiscal problems. His PhD in English had not prepared him for them. Olson left office in 1932. And in 1933, an angry Minnesota pastor wrote to the head of the Gustavus Adolphus Board, quote, "Your president is getting the highest salary in the Augustana Synods Minnesota Conference. If he knew what was good for him, he would offer a cut of at least $1,000 before it's too late for him," unquote. Historian Lum does not tell us whether President Johnson took the advice in the pay cut. He does tell us that O.J., as Johnson was known to everybody on campus then, would, when interviewing a prospective faculty member, sometimes mention, quote, a salary figure which was slightly above the figure that the person finally received when he joined the faculty, unquote. At Augustana, Conrad Bergedorf began his years as president at a salary of $3,600, which was modest, even in the Depression. It was, however, I suppose, the salary first mentioned to him by his honorable prospective employers. The sobering reminders of presidential situations at sister institutions must have been in Bergedorf's mind. But his presidency lasted into the 60s. In those 27 years, the school's finances were overseen in the main by 3 men, the third of whom, Glenn Brolander, is here tonight. He served for the last 2 years of Dr. Bergedorf's presidency as the treasurer and comptroller of the college, but Glenn's enormous influence upon the college remains to be told in the Sorensen years. Read the forthcoming boiler. The first of these treasurers, Carl H. Swanson, was a Minneapolis businessman who came to Rock Island to be treasurer and comptroller at the same time that Bergedorf began as president. Swanson may have been induced to take the position by the modest salary, or perhaps by the offer of a free room in the seminary dormitory. He was a bachelor, and those were his living quarters. He appears to have been somewhat startled by what he discovered about the fiscal condition of the school, for he had hardly begun his job when he tried to resign. He shouldn't have been completely surprised, however. He could have checked financial conditions at the 3 Lutheran schools closer to his hometown, 2 in southern Minnesota and 1 barely across the Iowa state line. Matters there were equally dismal. Budgets were seriously out of balance. Endowment income was shrinking, fund drive pledges and church annual grants were in arrears, and faculty salaries in each case had been cut by at least 20%. At St. Olaf, faculty went without annual salary contracts during the Depression and were paid a month at a time from any funds left over after fixed expenses had been paid. That was a powerful controller at St. Olaf. However, it seems to be the one of the 4 colleges whose president, the Reverend Lars W. Bowe, did not resign or find his position threatened due to the Depression. Well, in any event, Carl Swanson from Minneapolis sought to resign each year he remained in Rock Island. And finally, in 1938, the board of directors gave in and accepted that resignation. Enter the Reverend Knut Erik Erickson of Manchester, Connecticut, called to replace Swanson. Knut, as he was commonly known to his colleagues, had been a pastor and successful fundraiser in the Augustana Evangelical Lutheran Church. And now, as treasurer and comptroller, Erickson became the manager, protector, and promoter of Augustana's finances for over 2 decades, clearing up the wreckage of the Depression, steering the budget through the war years, and managing the growth of the endowment, budget, and facilities in the Eisenhower decade. When Erickson finally retired at the end of the 50s, the board of directors, whose predecessors had offered Carl Swanson a free dorm room in 1935, deeded Knut Erickson a Rock Island cemetery lot at no cost. Perhaps the most serious money problem Augustana and Erickson and Bergedorf faced in the grim mid-30s had to do with the Central States Securities Company. That Chicago firm, controlled by Swedish Americans, had been handling several large loans on properties in the Swedish-American neighborhoods of Chicago, loans that were made from the Augustana endowment. These were now in default. In May 1936, the board and Carl Swanson asked Swanson's predecessor as treasurer of the college, the Reverend Carl J. Johnson, to meet with them, the board members, quote, to explain several transactions in connection with loans made through Central States Securities Company during his incumbency, quote. Johnson was retired and living in Rock Island. He refused to show up at the board meeting. At that, a group of directors left the meeting room and filed down the street to the retired treasurer's home to air the matter there. The visit must have worked, for Johnson agreed to show up at next day's board meeting, quote, willing and ready to cooperate in full with the board in clearing up the matters in question, quote. College made a good faith effort to settle things with the Central Securities Company and its main figure, Byron Nelson, secretary and treasurer, but with no results. So Chicago lawyers were, of course, called in. Finally, in February 1937, the board of directors learned that Nelson had, in payment of the $40,000 he owed the college, agreed to pay $6,500 cash with a note for $17,000 more secured by properties that he and his mother owned in Sawyer, Michigan. The land was at Bethany Beach, a conservative Chautauqua-type summer resort on Lake Michigan, much favored by Chicago's Swedish Americans. The note was to be paid to Augustana at $100 a month. The college said the board's finance committee would sustain, quote, an ultimate substantial loss in connection with this situation, quote, but at least something had been salvaged from its real estate venture in the Chicago Swedish-American community. At the three other Lutheran schools, where investment in farm properties in the Great Plains were heavier than at Augustana, the drought which accompanied the Depression had effects equal to those caused in Illinois by the collapse of the Chicago real estate market. Behind the Central State security matter and the so-called Bethany Beach settlement lay a surprising lack of regulation of Augustana's real estate investments. Little was known about the properties mortgaged or owned. No appraisals or photographs were in the college files, and an alarming degree of default was taking place. Insurance on most of the properties had lapsed. Loans had been made without informing the board of directors. Agents were collecting loan payments which should have been forwarded to the college, but they often did not remit them, and property owners were in many cases receiving rents, but not making their mortgage payments. But Erickson and the board went to work, and by early 1941, the school's investment portfolio was, as the board minutes say, quote, in very good order, with delinquencies at a minimum, and with most of the hangovers from the Depression in the process of adjustment. Quote, what did they know about hangovers? But the college needed to move outside its immediate constituency in managing its finances. Professional advice was called for. The chairman of the finance committee, Einar Carlson, noted that his committee was made up, quote, of a preacher, a publisher, a doctor, a manufacturer, and a lawyer, quote. They were all Swedish Americans, but none of them had significant investment experience. When in 1936 the board had undertaken clearing up the Central States mess, the head of the finance committee told them that the process was, quote, serious and trying, at times almost heartbreaking. We are proceeding, tempering at all times action and decision with mercy and justice. Quote. Mercy and justice certainly had to be balanced, especially since some of what the Swedes call fiflande, chiseling by Byron Nelson and his colleagues in Central States had so seriously damaged Augustana. But in the years after the war, the Chicago Swedish-American community would do far better by Augustana than to secure bad debts with beach property at a church campground on Lake Michigan. In the early and mid-50s, the college was to receive a number of major gifts, which, when applied to developing the 26 acres of the Weyerhaeuser-Davis land, enormously improved the campus and facilities. In 1953, word came to Rock Island that Frank Larson, the deceased publisher of the Swedish American Tribune, had left a considerable bequest to the college. In an early will, Larson had given his entire estate, worth over $1 million, to Augustana, but a second will, written during his final illness, divided his wealth between the school and several relatives. Of course, a legal quarrel ensued, until finally attorneys for the two sides, family and college, settled the differences. The college got $309,000 against its hopes for $1 million. While it was not what they had expected, it was still big money. The college's yearly budget at that time was just under $600,000, so it represented a gift larger than half of the budget. A year later came better news yet. Mrs. J. N. Westerlin, the widow of a refrigeration engineer, had willed $500,000 to Augustana, most of it in the form of Chicago real estate. Bergedorf had known the Westerlin family since the 1920s. They had helped finance the year he had spent in Sweden writing his doctoral dissertation on the Swedish Reformation. Dr. Bergedorf originally intended that the money from selling the real estate be used for the endowment to improve faculty salaries. But when the college got the Weyerhaeuser Davis property, the president changed his mind. Though the house and the land from the Davises was valued at only $60,000, Rock Island real estate has always been a bargain, the Westerlin money, when used to develop it, would have a lasting impact on Augustana. President Bergedorf now envisioned, quote, building a women's campus, which would combine, quote, something of the privacy of a girls' school with the advantages of coeducation, quote. Women, he wrote, quote, should live together, eat together, play together in their own environment, and yet have access to all the educational facilities of the college, quote. Homemaking, arts and crafts, and physical education might be taught on that women's campus. The Westerlin money was used to build the first wing of a dormitory complex for women there. During the 60s, men's halls were also built on that property, so the women's campus plan did not materialize. And in 1959, Augustana received the last of the series of gifts from Chicago Swedish Americans. In this case, the donors were the collective owners of Emmanuel Women's Home, a North Side Chicago institution which had provided a residence for working women since the 19th century. Now, in the mid-20th century, its attended clientele had dwindled, the city had plans for the area, and there seemed no sense in relocating. The members of the Emmanuel Association voted 47-1, who was she, to give Augustana the $500,000 proceeds from selling their property. So another residence wing, Emmanuel Hall, was built on the Weyerhaeuser Davis land, opening in 1960. The other Lutheran schools also received major support from their Scandinavian Lutheran constituents. Luther College got almost $1 million from the estate of Mr. and Mrs. Lewis Olson in the late 50s. At Gustavus Adolphus, the Folk Bernadotte Library, Christ Chapel, and the Nobel Science Hall, all planned in the post-war years and completed by the school's centennial in 1962, were financed in large part by gifts from Augustana Synod people and from especially their Minnesota conference. St. Olaf's success in receiving and increasing support from the Norwegian American community is, of course, proverbial. At Augustana, the large bequest from Chicago Swedish Americans strengthened the college in years when the school's efforts at fundraising, or what they were then called ingatherings or appeals, met rather mixed results. Note that these efforts were not called campaigns. To call it a campaign would imply an aggressive, even military, approach to raising money that did not characterize Augustana's efforts in the 50s. Ingathering, especially, applied a more passive approach. He waited. One received gifts rather than going after them. In the late 40s, the Observer, the college paper, announced that one of these ingatherings for $1.5 million was underway. But within a year, Treasurer Erickson told the board that the appeal had stalled, having raised less than $1 million. It would be another decade before the college would attempt another such effort. This new campaign was going to coincide with the centennial of the school's founding in 1860. So in the decade of the 50s, between these fund drives, the Larson, Westerlin, and Emmanuel gifts were the means by which growth and improvement were realized. Nearly $1.5 million came to the college, double the amount of the annual operating budget in the 50s. That money came from no campaign. It was an in-gathering. O.V. Anderson's warning. Here I want to discuss the financial relationship between the college and the church, which were much more multifaceted than one might at first suppose. The gifts just discussed, as well as the Bethany Beach guarantee from Central States in the Depression, came from Swedish Americans who were for the most part Lutherans as well. Dog Blanc has reminded us that the Augustana Evangelical Lutheran Church, or more commonly the Augustana Synod, was the largest and most influential institution in Swedish American life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So closely were the affairs of college and synod tied in those years that one saying Augustana could never be sure in listening whether the school or the church were being referred to. These church-college ties were first of all spiritual, intellectual, and cultural, but they were also financial. There was an adage, it was half a joke at the college in the 40s and 50s, that a triumvirate ran. The Observer, in an April Fool issue in the middle of that decade, ventured that the members of that triumvirate were President Bergendorf, choir director Henry Bell, and Becky Beckstrom, director of the food services. So much did the students understand. Insiders knew that the Troika really consisted of Dr. Bergendorf, Treasurer Knut Eriksson, and Pastor E.E. Ryder, Chairman of the Board of Directors. These three ran Augustana, especially its finances. Each of them was an ordained minister of the Augustana Synod, each a graduate of the seminary. Together they negotiated from the school side the tricky and sometimes thorny path which the two Augustanas, church and college, took together through the years were considered. At first look, the money relationships between these two institutions, church and college, seemed simple. The school relied on the synod for support, importuning its clergy and laity at every opportunity for dollars, and never quite satisfied that enough was being done. As regarded synod support, the college's leaders were especially plaintive in the Depression years. At that time, the custom in preparing an annual budget for the college was to make projections of income and expense, invariably showing a deficit, often above 10% of the total, and balance the budget, at least on paper, by writing an annual grant from the Augustana Synod or certain of its regional conferences here in the Midwest. The amount of the church grant was invariably set at exactly the level of the college deficit. For example, the 40-41 budget showed expenses of $269,178,000, and income $236,178. The shortfall in this case, $33,000, or 12% of the budget, was to be met by what the board minutes say were necessary budget grants from three of the colleges, the Synod's regional conferences here in the central Middle-West. In the worst of the 30s, these conferences were not able to meet the necessary budget grants. In some cases, they fell short by over half, and pessimism reigned at the college. The Synod, wrote Bergendorf in his 1939 formal report to the church, had developed the practice, quote, of referring all responsibility for the college to conferences, which refused to assume that responsibility. That is jeopardizing the interests of the church in Augustana, quote. He added an apology lest his frequent expressions of concern become irritable repetition. In a personal letter, Bergendorf is more candid, quote, as between conference and synod, Augustana has the status of a stepchild, and while the foster parents argue about it, the stepchild must look elsewhere for support, quote. With the coming of better times, church support for Augustana did grow, and with it the president's spirits and his optimism about the church-college relationship. Now he spoke of it as a living endowment. He was not saying when he wrote about raising larger sums of money from business and industry, church gifts for the college's future. These were, quote, the best kind of endowment, quote. That was the view in Northfield, Minnesota at St. Olaf College as well. President Poe said, church gifts are, quote, the best endowment any college could have. Now, Bergendorf believed, of course, that some of this money would come from individual Lutherans, probably alumni. The yearly grants from the three geographical conferences that supported the church were the foundation, however, and those grants increased dramatically in the 50s. In the early years of that decade, they reached $115,000 annually, which was 10 times the amount received 15 years earlier in the late Depression. By 1962, Augustana was getting over $200,000 a year from the conferences. That represented 10% of the college's budget. At the other three schools, church support was equally generous. But there was reason for concern, at least in Rock Island. The Augustana Church planned to merge in 1962 with three other Lutheran bodies to form the Lutheran Church in America. The other churches, one descended from so-called English Lutherans with roots in colonial times, one with a Danish background and one with a Finnish, had their own colleges. There were widely varying degrees of support for these schools in those three other churches. Further, there were growing signs in American higher education that church membership was of decreasing importance when high school students decided how to pick a college. Some Protestant schools were breaking off their church connection. These and other trends would become increasingly pronounced in the 60s and 70s, but they were already emerging in the late Bergedorf years. Annual budget support of whatever amount was one side of the church-college financial relationship in the middle of the 20th century. The other, strange to us now, had to do with money that moved in the other direction, from college to church. The college loaned its endowment to the church and its conferences. In 1939, the Nebraska Conference asked that the rate of interest on one of these loans be reduced. By unanimous vote, the Augustana Board's Finance Committee refused to do so. In 1941, the Illinois Conference asked for a $30,000 loan, and the committee recommended against it, quote, unless adequate security can be pledged thereto, quote. No bank would make such a loan, they maintained, nor should a college. At the same meeting, a 30-year-old debt of the Nebraska Conference for $5,000 was settled for $2,800 cash, and interest on a $10,000 loan to the Minnesota Conference was reduced from 5 to 3%. But the board warned if there were any failure by Minnesota to meet the payments, the rate would go back up to 5. So while the college continued to look to the church and individual members for annual support and capital gifts, the board had been lending some of the same endowment those gifts had built back to the conferences, and then turned down most requests for mercy when payments could not be met. At the three other Scandinavian Lutheran colleges, reciprocal financial arrangements with the church had also developed. At Luther, for example, the college had a 1/2 interest in the property of First Lutheran Church, Decorah, Iowa, and was responsible for half the cost of repairs and upkeep. Such financial relationships as these were perhaps rooted in immigrant times, when Scandinavian Lutherans had of necessity to turn to one another for help. These arrangements would disappear after World War II, leaving, one might suppose, at least in the case of Augustana, some residue of ill will in the church's conferences. The major gifts of the 50s from Larson and Westerlund and Emmanuel, and the growth of church support meant that as Augustana planned for its centennial, its leaders assumed that the church and its people should be the major source of gifts, and that regular annual budget grants from the conferences would also keep growing. President Bergedorf and Treasurer Erickson were perhaps envious of the success of Gustavus Adolphus College in increasing support in Minnesota for campus construction. They must have hoped that the Illinois Conference would be able to meet Minnesota's generosity, but that was not to be. Everyone representing the church on the Augustana board was not convinced about the strategy of seeking increased help from the church. In fact, at a 1958 board meeting, Dr. O.B. Anderson, the president of the Illinois Conference of the Augustana Synod, asked whether, quote, Augustana College had taken steps to appeal to other groups than to the church for centennial funds, quote. The answer from the administration, recorded in the board minutes, and I love it, was partly yes and partly no. I've used that one many times. School leaders had from time to time in the past asked the church to provide for special needs and problems, and now, in the late 50s, Knut Erickson asked whether those conferences could grant extra money to help the college with debt service on loans taken out to build student housing. These grants would be used to meet loan payments for 3 years, until receipts from the centennial ingathering were gathered in. But the church remembered the loans. O.V. Anderson understood that the coming merger of the Augustana Church into the Lutheran Church in America meant a change in church-college relationship and support, and that was the reason for his veiled mourning. The new centennial program would be, quote, a grand opportunity for Augustana to gain a new place in the sun, quote, Anderson said. He noted that church gifts had to be met with equally large grants from other sources. Knut Eriksson replied in the board meeting that the college was not fighting for its own interests, but for the life of the church itself. Anderson then, quote, commanded Dr. Eriksson to make the same appeal in his Chicago office at 9:30 a.m. June 12th. Quote. So church leaders not as familiar with Augustana as O.V. Anderson was needed to hear the case for supporting the school. From the time of the founding of the two Augustanas, the synod and the college, the assumption of the school's leaders was that the interests of the church and the colleges were identical. For nearly a century, these schools, Augustana and the others, had been the major source of leadership for Scandinavian Lutheran church bodies. Most of their clergy and lay leadership had studied at one of those schools. That was as true of the Norwegian Lutherans as it was of the Swedish. Any serious Lutheran leader was directed by his or her pastor to one of those schools. But again, by mid-century, this was beginning to change. Many college-bound young Lutherans enrolled in state universities and some of the nation's great private colleges. In the Augustana Synod, the question was whether the church colleges would be able to stand on their own, taking a place among American liberal arts schools on their merits as institutions of higher education, church-related or not. What had been a parent-child relationship was becoming one between two mature institutions, ecclesiastic and education. Certainly, many of the senior leaders of the church remained committed to its ties with the schools. They supported Augustana College's Centennial Fund drive, and that drive did result in enough money to warrant beginning construction on Centennial Hall, the concert venue across the street, which was going to house performances of the Tri-City Symphony, as well as a host of other college events, supremely the annual Messiah performance. About $350,000 was raised against a goal of $450,000 for that project in the community. The church's special support of its colleges is going to be expressed through a separate fund campaign, and as the 50s wound down and the 62 merger loomed, the leaders of the Augustana Church decided to undertake a final fundraising effort for their 4 baccalaureate colleges. The program they planned was Our Christian College Advance, quickly known as OCCA. Total money raised was to be $4.5 million, of which Augustana would get $1 million. Bergendorf was ambivalent, writing that, quote, while the sum is inadequate for the needs of the college, we must acknowledge the determination of the church to keep Augustana financially sound, quote. By 1962, the year of the church merger and Bergendorf's retirement, $519,000 of the whole $4 million from OCCA had been collected and sent to Rock Island. So the last effort of the church, like many earlier ones, was well-intended and significant, but it was only partly successful. In that sense, O.V. Anderson's veiled mourning had been prophetic. And lastly, bust and war and boom. Looking back, it is clear that at least by contemporary standards, Augustana was close to financial disaster in 1935. Arnold Barton has written of the way in which the Depression undermines Swedish American organizations, publications, businesses. That observation can be applied to the colleges of the Augustana Synod as well. It's no wonder that H Swanson, the new treasurer, wanted to give up his free dorm room and go back to Minneapolis once he looked at the books in Rock Island. A local accounting firm of I.B. Mccullough, still in business, were called in to examine these books, and they were equally disconcerted. Quote, there appears to be no definite policy of safeguarding the institution's funds, quote, they wrote, urging, quote, an effective system of budget control be inaugurated, quote. The measures they recommended included setting up a college budget committee, building annual budgets on expected actual income rather than money hoped for, creating an accounting system that would permit real year-to-year comparisons, restricting expenditures to those in the budget, and, most revolutionary, making periodic budget reports through the annual cycle rather than simply at the end of the year, so that the college's leaders would know where they stood in January and March, as well as in the summer when the books closed. This report, made to the board at Bergedorf's first meeting as president in October 35, came at a time when faculty salaries had been cut well over 10%. Church support was shrinking, and the endowment, as I've already said, had suffered major losses and further were expected. The leaders of the school had clearly been barely able to keep track of, let alone control, their finances. One question still being debated by American historians concerning the country's history in general is whether FDR's New Deal was the force that saved the nation from the Great Depression. The board of directors at Augustana were pretty sure it wasn't. It was a Democrat. Or whether fiscal viability came as a result of World War II, which some historians have regarded as the greatest pump priming operation in U.S. history. Whatever one's view on this larger question, it's clear that Augustana's fiscal situation was finally stabilized by the impact of the war on the school budget, especially on the income side. When the United States entered the war, in late 41 and early 42, there was, of course, a mass exodus of men from the campus. In 1941, the male-to-female ratio was 3 to 2. 2 years later, it was 1 to 2. Total enrollment dropped by 1/3 in those 2 years, to under 400 students. When in 1943, 250 Army Air Cadets arrived on campus for classes and for flight instruction at the Moline Airport, the college got a major financial boost from the government income that came with them. Financial help was, of course, not the most significant change brought on by the war. As news of the deaths of Augustana servicemen began to reach the school, the college newspaper reported, quote, "Every day we feel the grip of war getting tighter. Old frivolities pass by the board. Study gets more concentrated," unquote. Those were not the changes, rumors of which reached St. Peter, Minnesota. There, at a Gustavus board meeting, it was reported that the USO in Rock Island was actually holding dances for the Air Cadets in the Augustana Gymnasium, and that co-eds were attending. But not the worst of it, however. A Gustavus Adolphus board member wrote to a friend, quote, "Here is something strictly confidential, but it horrifies me so that I must tell you. The Augustana Medical Department contraceptives are distributed, just like at any other army post." So when Conrad Bergedorf wrote to his counterpart at Gustavus that military training on the campus was worthwhile, there were deep but confidential reservations on the Minnesota College board. Would it be worth housing an army unit at such terrible cost? Gustavus decided to take naval cadets instead. Unlike the Army in Rock Island, quote, "The Navy has always been considerate of the needs and interests of the college," Gustavus' president wrote. St. Olaf also took Navy and 600 air cadets. Neither Minnesota college historian writes about the federal income that their college must have received from the program, but it was, in any case, federal money that kept Augustana running during the war years. Nearly 40% of the annual operating budget of $250,000 was being covered by the Air Cadet program in Rock Island. Half of the physics department salaries and 1/4 of those in English were paid by the Army. And when the great post-war flood of veterans hit the campus in the later 40s, they brought more government dollars with them. In this case, the money came directly with the students to pay their expenses, rather than as an operating grant to the college. The tuition received from the GI Bill further accustomed Augustana to operating with federal money. This dependence would continue here, as at most American colleges and universities, well past the immediate post-war years. So World War II had changed Augustana. For the whole country, the conflict had meant a social reshuffling without precedent in its history. A great internal migration to the West Coast, large numbers of women entering the workforce, the mingling in the armed services of men and women from every ethnic, geographic, and cultural corner of the country, Afro-Americans drafted like all others, the generation and distribution of enormous new wealth. All of these affected a social restructuring that the New Deal seems never to have achieved. In the northeast corner of Rock Island, the changes brought by war and its aftermath were as proportionately great as they had been in a nation at large. The student body and the faculty grew increasingly multinomial. In 1940, 60% of the graduating class had Scandinavian family names. That dropped to 40% by the late 50s. In the same period, the percentage of the faculty with respectable Swedish surnames dropped from 75 to 50%. Doug Blanc and I are attempting elsewhere to deal with the larger question of the Swedish-American character of Augustana in these years. Here I want simply to note that the factors which influenced and indeed came to control the college's finances were the larger economic shifts in American life, and especially in higher education, brought by depression and war. The ethnic religious community, which had created and sustained the college for its first 75 years, now influenced its finances to an ever-decreasing degree. Whereas in the pre-war period, these finances were, for better or for worse, determined by the Augustana Synod, particularly in the Middle West, the post-war years saw a great shift. This is not to suggest that Swedish Americans, or for that matter, any other ethnic group, were by nature fiscally incompetent or irresponsible. But it certainly is the case that as Augustana's financial situation was increasingly controlled and stabilized by mid-century American accounting and investment practices and policies, that situation improved considerably. And it was not merely that policy and practice changed, so did income. Federal and state money, first through the GI Bill, and then through growing state and federal scholarship and loan programs, came to finance an ever-growing fraction of student costs, and thus the tuition. And counter to the intuition of its leaders, Augustana began to attract money from local and national businesses and from charitable foundations, as did the other schools I've mentioned. The Ford Foundation, for example, gave each of them several $100,000 to strengthen faculty salaries in the mid-50s. Therefore, wealth generated by the war and its aftermath became of increasing importance. The three major gifts to Augustana in the 50s that I talked about were from Swedish Americans, coming because of long loyalties and relationships. But as a fraction of total annual college income, no subsequent gift from the Swedish American quarter would be nearly as large as those had been. And this historical constituency of the school was itself being absorbed into wider American society. The Depression had shaken the school's finances to their foundation. The war had stabilized them. And now in the post-war years, some of the school's leaders, perhaps reluctantly, seem to realize that the sources of income from tuition and from gifts lay beyond its founding community, the Augustana Synod. At the other three colleges mentioned in this paper, the effort to reach for support beyond traditional ethnic religious groups was also underway after the war. And of course, located as they are in the states where Scandinavian influence is much stronger than it is in Illinois, the traditional identities and ties of those schools have continued to be more important for them than, frankly, they are at Augustana. Some tension grew up here in Rock Island over this matter of the college's character. In the 50s, the administration was still convinced that their institution's identity and hopes lay in its ethnic religious community. But many of the board of directors were not so sure. Though all of those directors were themselves Augustana Synod people, many of them did not view their own lives and careers as defined by their Swedish Lutheranness. And they wanted their school as well to find what O.B. Anderson had called a new place in the sun. When Augustana found that place in the wider world of American higher education, it did so with financial techniques which were themselves Americanized. In the 40s and 50s, that was the case with accounting and budgeting processes. The relatively parochial and sometimes primitive methods used in the 30s gave way to more effective and sophisticated ones. Differences also developed between board administrators over the question of how and where gift money ought to be sought. Through the 50s, a number of individual directors urged the college's leaders to find and to employ competent professional fundraisers, or as they were beginning to be called, development people. Some even offered to pay the startup salaries of the additional staff in development. For his part, President Bergedorf readily acknowledged that, quote, begging money is not my strong point, quote. He felt that while other schools, some, even Scandinavian Lutheran ones, tended to toot their own horns, he wrote, Augustana should not need to do so. But some of the board did not view the matter in this way. In the late 50s, a new group of younger directors, all elected by the church, prevailed upon their colleagues to form a development committee, which was charged with creating a master plan for staffing and directing the college's efforts to restructure its quest for money. It remained for the next administration under President C.W. Sorensen to Americanize this aspect of Augustana's financial life, guided by the plans of that special board committee. At times, the study of ethnic identity in America has understandably and perhaps of necessity concentrated on specific ethnic subpopulations and their own internal evolution, and not been so much concerned with the wider impact of American life and development upon these groups. But panic, war, depression, political ideology, electoral politics, these and other factors may have affected ethnic identity as surely as the evolution and struggles within particular groups did. At least in the life of one Swedish-American institution, the effects of depression and war and post-war expansion cannot be underestimated. Between them, they Americanized the finances of the immigrant college in Illinois, both as regarded budgeting and fundraising, and the short postscript. I began by mentioning some recreational reading I had done. Warren Palmo's 2006 Nobel lecture suggested that one might discover matters of interest and importance in the hinterlands, as well as in the intellectual centers of the world, if such there are. May I mention another piece of such personal reading? This has relevance not so much to geographical distance from the center of things as it does to temporal distance from our current way of looking at the world. The second work is by Dermot Mccullough, an Oxford University historian. Mccullough has received much praise for his 2003 The Reformation by History. In that work, the Oxford scholar discusses some of the theological intricacies that so greatly agitated the 16th century Protestant reformers. He insists that if we are to do justice to our forebears, we, quote, must not flinch from some discussion which may seem dauntingly technical. The reward will be to glimpse some of the distinctions which were among the most important matters in the world to people in Europe 5 centuries ago. Quote, if that is true of the intricacies of Protestant theology 5 centuries ago, it might by some stretch be applied to the obscurities of Augustana's finances 5 decades ago that I discussed tonight. A world seems to separate us from the bare bones struggle to keep the school functioning through the Depression, from the lack of system in its accounting practices, the seeming irresponsibility of its investment policy, the surprising reciprocity of its dealings with its sin, and the vicissitudes of its search for gifts. But these were, quote, among the most important matters in the world, quote, for the people who half a century ago sought to keep Augustana alive. We watched them deal from the 1930s to the 60s with Americanizing its finances, and we realized that in the effort, they transformed as well as preserved the Swedish Lutheran College in the northeast corner of Rock Island, Illinois. We are rattled by their problems, startled by their tenacity, and perhaps even surprised at their successes. How did they ever manage, we wonder? But then we remember, they were, after all, Swedish Lutherans.